Emma Hale was 41 years old the spring she pried up her father's attic floor, and what she found underneath it would end up changing the way she understood the man for the rest of her life. I'm Grandpa Ben, folks, and this here's her story. Walter Hale had been a structural engineer for 41 years bridges. Mostly a couple of dams early in his career, the kind of work where being off by a 16th of an inch wasn't a mistake, it was a liability. Man was precise the way some men are tall, couldn't help it. Kept his tools organized by function, and then alphabetized within function. His kids Emma and her younger brother Nate grew up understanding pretty early on that their father loved them the way an engineer loves a structure, by making sure the foundation was sound, the roof didn't leak, and the bills got paid on time. What he wasn't real good at, and both his kids would have told you this without hesitating, was saying the actual words. Walter Hale built you a life. He didn't often tell you he loved you doing it. He passed in his sleep at 72 3 years back now, and it took the family a good while to get around to dealing with the same house Emma and Nate had grown up in, out at the edge of a little valley town. The kind of place where everybody still knows whose truck belongs to who. Emma was the one who ended up handling most of it, being local, while Nate had moved out to Denver for work and could really only come back on weekends. They decided, after a lot of hemming and hawing, to sell the place. Too big for memories to rattle around in alone, too full of a man who wasn't there to fill it anymore. It was a contractor doing some pre-sale repair work, replacing some water-damaged flooring up in the attic. Nothing dramatic, who called Emma up on a Tuesday afternoon, sounding a little rattled, and said, "Ma'am, I think you'd better come take a look at this before I go any further." What he'd found, once he pried up 3 of the old floorboards, was graphite, not a paper map tucked underneath. Mind you, that would have been strange enough on its own. This was drawn straight onto the raw wood itself, directly onto the underside of the subfloor, in pencil that had clearly been gone over again and again over what must have been years, based on how deep and dark some of the lines had worn into the grain. A sprawling, careful, deliberate network of lines, simples, little marks that looked almost like elevation notes, a compass rose drawn with the same exacting hand Walter used for his blueprints. It didn't look like doodling. It looked like a document, like something a man sits with, alone, over a long stretch of years, adding to a little at a time. Emma stood there in that attic a long while, flashlight in hand, just staring at it. Her father, a man who threw nothing away by accident and left nothing to chance, had spent what looked like decades secretly drawing something into the floor of his own house, someplace he knew nobody would ever think to look. And he'd never said one word about it. Not to her. Not to Nate. Not, as far as anyone could tell, to a single living soul. Now Nate's reaction, when Emma called him that night, was about what you'd expect from a man who'd spent a lifetime a little exhausted by his father's need to control every last detail of everything. "Emma," he said, "Dad drew something weird on a floor. That's Dad. That's the most Dad thing that man ever did. Sell the house, keep a picture of it if you want, and let's move on." He wasn't trying to be cold about it. Understand, that's just how Nate had learned to survive being Walter Hale's son. Distance was the strategy that worked for him, It had worked for 30-some years. Wasn't about to change now over a pencil drawing in an attic nobody was going to see again after closing, but it sat with Emma different. Ate at her, if we're honest about it. So she did what her father's own daughter would do. She got methodical about it. Photographed every square inch of that floor before the contractor could finish tearing it out. Overlaid the shape of it, best she could, onto satellite maps of the valley, trying to match the lines to real roads, real ridge lines, real anything. And here's the strange part. Folks, it matched nothing. Not one landmark on any modern map lined up with what was drawn on that wood. No trail. No property line. No creek bed. It was like her father had drawn a place that had been erased. That's what sent her to Ray Alvarez, who'd run the little county historical society out of a converted feed store for going on 30 years. And who, much to Emma's relief, actually lit up when she showed him the photographs. Told her the shape of it looked an awful lot like the old boundary lines from before the valley got resurveyed back in the early 70s, when a lot of small parcels, old family orchards, a stretch of logging path, a couple of homestead plots got bought up and folded together. That whole consolidated stretch, Ray told her, was the very same acreage now managed as protected land by a regional land trust, so whatever her father had been mapping, it was sitting inside land that still existed, just under different management and a different name than it had worn when he was a boy. And then Ray said something that stopped Emma cold. Said the Hale family used to own one of those old parcels generations back Walter's own grandfather's orchard, sold off during hard times in the 30s. Ray even had an old deed on file with the name Hale on it, filed away in a box nobody'd pulled out in decades. That's when Emma understood, at least in part, what she was looking at. Her father hadn't drawn a mystery. He'd drawn a memory, a place that used to belong to his family, long before it belonged to anybody else, redrawn from wherever inside him he'd been carrying it all those years. She went back through the house after that with fresh eyes, and up in a corner of the attic, tucked behind an old steamer trunk, she found a stack of her father's private notebooks, not work journals, personal ones, going back further than she'd realized he'd even kept anything like that. And reading through them, slow, over several nights, she started piecing together a picture of her father as a boy that she'd genuinely never had before. Walter's own father, it turned out, had been a hard man, not cruel exactly, but cold, demanding, quick with criticism, and slow with anything resembling warmth. And as a kid, Walter used to slip out to that old family orchard whenever things at home got to be too much, walk the same paths over and over, mark them in his head the way he'd later learned to mark them on paper. It was the one place, as a boy, he ever remembered feeling like nobody was grading him. One entry from childhood, tucked in near the front of the earliest notebook, even mentioned the afternoon he'd carved his initials into an old apple tree at the edge of the property, a small thing, done quick with a pocket knife, the kind of mark a kid leaves without thinking twice about it. The notebooks made it plain he'd never really stopped going back there, not just in his mind, either. Entries scattered across nearly every one of those 20 years showed he'd made the drive out to that orchard in secret. 2 or 3 times a year most years, usually in the fall, always alone. Each trip, it looked like he'd come home and add a little more to the map under the floorboards, a landmark he'd rediscovered, a path that had grown over, the place where his grandfather's old fence line used to run. That's how he'd known, all those years later, that the carved tree was still standing right where he'd left it. He'd walked past it on nearly every one of those trips, running his thumb over those same two initials he'd cut into the bark as a boy. And on a handful of those visits, 5, spread out across the full 20 years, he'd bring something else along with him. A letter, written to Emma or to Nate in some quiet week, when the weight of not saying it out loud had gotten to be too much to carry. He'd bury it there in a rusted tin box he kept adding to, sealing it back up with fresh tar each time before he drove home. One entry, dated maybe 15 years back, said plain as anything that he meant to take Emma and Nate out there someday, show them where he used to go, tell them what it meant to him. He just never quite found, or maybe never quite let himself find the moment to do it. Now, Emma wasn't about to let that stay unfinished. She called Nate, told him everything she'd learned, and credit to him, the man who'd told her a week earlier to sell the house and move on, got quiet on the phone a long while, and then said he'd drive out that weekend. They got permission from the land trust to walk the parcel. Turned out the woman who managed it was only too happy to have somebody who actually remembered the old boundary lines. Said most of that history had gone unrecorded since the families who'd once worked that land had mostly moved on or passed away. Emma brought a drone to help match the ridgelines against her father's drawing, and it took the better part of a Saturday, tramping through brush and deadfall, second-guessing every turn, before Nate, walking a little ahead, stopped dead and called Emma's name in a voice that made her run to catch up. There, carved into the base of an old, gnarled apple tree, half swallowed by bark that had grown up around it over the decades, were two initials, WH, exactly where the floorboard map said they'd be. They dug, gentle, right at the base of that tree, and about a foot down they found the rusted tin box, sealed up tight with what looked like decades of fresh overrolled tar layered on again and again. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow kept the damp mostly out, were the letters, 5 of them, dated across nearly 20 years, each one addressed either to Emma or to Nate, and not one of them ever sent. They sat right there under that tree and read them together, the two of them, taking turns out loud, because neither one could quite finish a whole letter alone without their voice giving out. Their father had written, across 2 decades and 5 quiet attempts, about wanting to bring them here. About what this place had meant to him as a boy who never felt good enough for the man who raised him. About being scared, genuinely, plainly scared, in his own careful handwriting, that if he ever really opened up to his own kids the way this place had once opened up to him, it would come out clumsy and inadequate, and he'd rather stay quiet than risk getting it wrong in front of the 2 people whose opinion of him mattered most. He never did get it right in the end. Not out loud, not in his lifetime. But he'd been trying in his own particular way for longer than either of his kids had ever known. Emma and Nate go back out to that orchard together now, a few times a year, along with Emma's own 2 boys these days. They've kept it simple, no plaque, no fuss, nothing their father would have rolled his eyes at, just a spot they show up to, the way he used to show up to it alone. Except now there's more than one set of feet wearing down that old path. What Emma came to understand, going through all of it, was that her father's greatest inheritance to his kids wasn't the house, wasn't the career, wasn't even, really, the letters, as much as those meant to her. It was that orchard itself proof that even a man who never learned how to say the words out loud had spent 20 years trying to find a way to say them anyway. Now, maybe you don't have an attic with a secret drawn into the floorboards, folks, but I'd wager a fair number of you watching this have got somebody in your life who never quite found the words either. Somebody whose love you had to go looking for, in the things they did instead of the things they said. So tell me down in the comments, is there someone in your life like that? I read every one of them, I promise you that. And if this one found you at the right moment tonight, stick around, folks. I've got more stories like it every single week. Take care of yourselves, and maybe, while you've still got the chance, go on and say the thing out loud.